So when I think about it, that from kind of this idea of the tree of consciousness, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about what I mean by this tree of consciousness.
Yes, please.
And what all these branching lines we are. So to do that, let's think about, from the moment that you were actually a baby and you were born. So you're thrust into this world, and last time we kind of spoke about how you had to basically learn separateness from that moment.
Yes.
And as you begin to learn, this baby actually is unencumbered actually by memory. Right. So in fact, you talk a lot about how to access that supreme being, you have to become memoryless and live in this exact moment. But in fact, all babies are actually born into this state. And from this state, actually, the different branches of your consciousness grow. Now, why does it grow? Because when you're born, actually, the world is too vast. There's too many different possibilities. So in fact, you need to find little ways and little artificial constructs to create shortcuts for yourself so that you can start perceiving the world.
Right.
Even perception itself, like how your senses are able to see something and perceive that this is a book, that this is red and this is black. All of this knowledge is actually you're not born with it. You actually have to learn it by perceiving the world and living basically in the present. And in fact, when we talk about meditation, it's that we are actually trying to get to that state where we can, be completely memoryless, and in those states are the times when the branches of your consciousness are actually able to grow and basically develop these different personalities. And one area that I thought maybe we could delve a little bit deeper into is, as your branches grow, each branch basically is growing so that you can find ways to cope with the world. So there may be a branch of you that copes with, how to deal with your parents, how to deal with hunger. So you learn to cry and you call for help or whatever it is. And each of these...
If I may ask in between, some of these things may also be instinctual in the child because it has the genes of the parents who have gone through.
Even instinctual is still embedded knowledge within the genome itself.
Yeah.
So it was still a learned process, but the process isn't within the mind. The process of learning was actually happening within the genome, where the genome basically had to alter and change and create these instincts. So there's still a learning process, but the learning process evolved from the genome, and then now as we evolve further and further into multicellular organism, it's now that we are able to create mind constructs itself as well. Now these mind constructs, one thing that as I looked into Indian teachings, and you spoke a little bit about actually even in the Satsang for Shivratri, is this idea of Devas and Asuras actually. And in fact, when I look into like the Devas and Asuras and I look at the characteristics, it's almost as if you're describing, like these things are describing actually characteristics within us. It almost seems like a technology to show that as we develop our personalities, certain characteristics actually start to cluster together. And in fact, the Indian teachings even say it, that God is within you. And in fact, it seems almost like these Asuras and Devas are ways to describe the characteristics within ourselves, which, from the fractal geometric perspective, it's that they're describing basically different branches of yourself that can grow out from this idea of separateness. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your thoughts on kind of what, the Devas and Asuras are based on kind of the, Hindu teachings basically.
Now, when the Hindu teachings say Asura and Deva, it's not a watertight compartment that these are Asuras. There are some good Asuras and there are some bad Devas. So, actually the word Asura and Deva simply means two sides of one's being.
Yes, and in fact, with that, I wanted to say, like, for us, we're also conflicted. For us, we always want constant expansion, but we also want stability. So whenever I thought about kind of the Asuras and Devas, the Asuras are the ones that want expansion, and the Devas are kind of the ones that want stability. And is that kind of the way you see it as well? Or?
In the Indian scriptures and Indian Puranas, Devas are supposed to be divine beings. They're never born as human beings. They live in a separate place called Devaloka. The Asuras, on the other hand, also are divine beings, but many of them live on earth like human beings. Even Ravana, the king of Lanka, is supposed to have been an Asura. So I think when they say Asura and Deva, it means more like saying anode and cathode, rather than in a bad way. Although over the years the Asuras have been depicted as bad people and the Devas are good fellows. But it is the Devas who are constantly working mischief. Why? Because when you say Deva, it means the sense organs. Indra is the head of the Devas. He's the head of all the sense organs, which are enjoyable for us in this world, of course, no denying that. Now the Asuras are those which give tendencies by which you don't enjoy this world. So they are always imposing themselves. These qualities are the Asuras, which take you to dark worlds where you don't see light. This is the way it is depicted. But you'll see in the churning of the ocean, both are required.
Yes, because in fact both are required for you to constantly move and
Yes,
evolve and grow.
that's what I'm trying to say. That Asuras are not sidelined, but they're not bad people. Asuras are one side of the story and Devas are the other.
Yes, in fact, somewhere I read that if there were no Asuras and there were no Devas, then there would actually be no more expansion, because you need that basically churning.
There is no way to, then you don't have anything to conquer. So, Yogi keeps both of them on the equal footing.
Right. And in fact, it's just human nature to just try to classify things as good and bad, actually. But these are just actually human.
Absolutely. But so why I'm saying this, it's not the same concept as the Semitic concept of Saturn and God. No.
Right. Yes.
That is different. There, Saturn is bad, never good. Here, Asuras are not like that.
There's always a mixture.
Yeah. So, which means wise men discovered that we, even human beings, have a mixture of both tendencies in us. One may predominate, the other may predominate.
One is good for certain aspects, and the other one is good
something
for other
else.
aspects.
Yeah.
And in fact, I feel like really a lot of the trouble with people is when they start using the wrong aspects for wrong situations, basically. Like for instance, I like to go use the analogy of people who feel that they can't do mathematics, for instance. Really, the problem is there's a personality in you that's been learned, and there's a branch of your consciousness that says, don't allow other people to see your weakness, basically. And it's very useful in the business world, for instance, where you don't want other people to see that you don't know certain things.
Right.
And the problem with that is that now when you take that personality and you bring that to other facets of your life which aren't as productive, it actually starts to create problems in you. So you try to do a math problem and you can't do it. And then you become embarrassed because some people are looking at you, so then you say, okay, well, math isn't really my thing, and then you start to avoid it. And because you start to avoid it, then you actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy in yourself, and you say, oh, I can't do math, so whenever there's a mathematical problem, you don't want to embarrass yourself, so you say, this is not even, why do I...
That is the Asuric tendency.
Yes.
Precisely.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that Asuric tendency is actually useful in certain instances, actually. So in fact, it's not so much that the Asuras are evil. It's just that we tend to use those things in situations in our lives which we actually shouldn't be using them in. Yes. So going a little bit further, and you talked about consciousness from the Mandikya Upanishads, and really I want to focus more on kind of the waking state, because I think that's the state that, for now anyways, maybe in a further talk we can talk more about like the dream states and the other two states. But in terms of the waking state, if we say that your consciousness kind of grows out, that waking state of your consciousness kind of grows out like a tree. And as I said, from the moment you're a baby, basically you are learning basically by observing what is currently happening and creating basically almost shortcuts for yourself on how to deal with certain situations. And again, these shortcuts that you created for yourself can be useful in certain instances. Like for instance, let's say when you're very young you get bitten by a dog and then you become afraid of dogs. Now it can be useful if you're always around aggressive dogs to kind of be wary about these dogs and stay away from them. But now if you start using them in the wrong situations, now for instance, like Monkey sitting here, and people who are afraid of dogs, even when they see Monkey and he's very quiet, they immediately become afraid of it. In the same way, certain people say, oh, I'm not a good public speaker. But ultimately, it was because at some instance, they got a negative feedback from doing a public speaking, and then they felt embarrassed about it. And now, because of that, they create basically limitations in themselves, actually. And it's these limitations in themselves that actually I want to talk about as kind of the main topic that I wanted to talk about, which, if our consciousness is kind of in this tree-like structure, how can we kind of overcome the structures that we have created and the limitations that we've created in ourselves, basically?
This is exactly what the whole spiritual journey is, even according to Vedanta. We think we are this body only and nothing beyond. And we think therefore we have to stay with the limitations of the body. The yogi or the Vedantin is one who says in true essence the consciousness is unlimited. It cannot even be completely understood by the senses because the senses are limited. Part of the limitation, You can't have a telescope which can see into infinity. You can see only up to some distance. So in the same way, so when the yogi realizes that really deep down in the essence, in the core of his consciousness, there is something infinite energy, infinite intelligence, infinite power, then he slowly begins to deal with the handicaps which he has developed by saying, no, I can't do this, no, I am weak. In fact, they say, be strong. In the Upanishads say, if you are not strong, then you are not spiritual, not physically. So the whole journey is to realize that you are not limited. That you are not limited. Somebody said it very beautifully. Swami Vivekananda said, I don't know who did the first mischief or how, but we seem to be living in a hypnotic trance, saying that we are only this, we are limited, we cannot do this.
To associate ourselves with the different branches.
Limitations. And he said what we need is a dehypnotization to wake us up to say, no, we have infinite potentials. And finally, to reach the infinite potential of one's being is the aim of the spiritual journey, according to the Upanishad. So it's a very, very inspiring goal. Now, because the goal is so huge, you might have to sacrifice a few things. You know that if you want to do something serious, you need to live up. So this is the meaning of sacrifice here.
And in fact, I think you touched on it a little bit again on the Satsang that you talked about with Shiva, basically, and you basically said Shiva is basically the destroyer of artificial constructs.
Yeah.
And these artificial constructs, in terms of mathematics, are basically like these branches of your consciousness, which basically have been created to help you navigate the world, but also start to set limitations within yourself. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how Shiva is the destroyer of these artificial constructs.
Now, on one hand, Shiva is depicted as a person with a form. On the ultimate sense, Shiva is depicted as invisible, all-pervading consciousness. Okay. In between these two, there is one where Shiva is worshipped as a linga, which has no human form but just a black stone, which is like a pillar. So these are three aspects of Shivam. The real meaning of the word Shivam is auspiciousness, fullness, infinity, and blissfulness. This is the meaning of Shivam. So finally, Shiva is also depicted as a great dancer, because in the Shaiva literature, they say the whole world is undergoing a dance, and this is the man who is responsible for it. And when he dances, he can dance in happiness, he can also dance in the destructive way. The Tandava Nirta is when the world begins to shiver. It's too much for it to understand or hold. Then all barriers are broken. All structures are broken. It becomes non-structural. So the real essence of Shivam is that non-structural being, which and the good news is that they also say that being is also your essence. So inside you also there is a seed of that.
Yes, and in fact that's where the separateness grows from.
Yeah.
The seed of, yes.
So once you see that, then you see your connection with that infinite Shivam, and then you wake up and say, why am I thinking I am limited? So this is, and then there is the other side, which is Shiva and Shakti. Shakti is the active kinetic energy, and Shiva is the potential quiet energy. But it is potential. But it is silent. It's a tranquil. When Shiva is dancing, there is a small aspect of Shakti there. When there is no Shakti, then he prefers to sit with meditating with the third eye open. Was nothing.